Hello, welcome back to In the English Corner. I would like to discuss the role of active and passive voices in your writing. So if you'd like to follow along with me in this video, let's look at what does it mean if you're writing in either an active or a passive voice. Remember that verbs can be in different tenses. So your verbs can be in the past, they can be in the present, and they can also be in the future. Not only that, but verbs can also have something called a voice. And the voice can either be active or passive depending on your style of writing, what you're choosing to write about, how formal you want your writing to be, etc. So to improve your writing, you really need to understand the differences between using an active voice and using a passive voice. So let's please take a look at the differences. First of all, active voice. In sentences, when you're writing in the active voice verb, the person who's doing the action, who's called the doer of the action, becomes the subject of the sentence. In other words, the subject of the sentence is performing the action of the verb. Again, let's look at examples and it'll make it a little clearer. Here are some examples of active voice verbs. The first one, the snowstorm crippled the city. The subject is snowstorm and it's performing the action, so it's in the active voice. It's the snowstorm that's crippling the city. In the second example, grade 10 students edited the school yearbook. The students are the subject and they're performing the action. What are they doing? They're editing the school yearbook, so it's the active voice. The third example, someone delivered the parcel today. The subject is someone, and that someone is actually delivering the parcel today, so that's also the active voice. The last example, Susie planted lettuce and tomatoes in her garden. You've got the subject Susie, and Susie is performing the action. She's the doer of the action. She's actually doing the planting of the lettuce and the tomatoes in her garden, and therefore that's the active voice. Now let's look at these four sentences and turn them into the passive voice so you can understand the difference. Looking at the passive voice, in sentences with passive voice verbs, the subject of the sentence is now the receiver of the action, no longer the doer. So the subject is actually receiving the action. The subject does not act, but now the subject is acted upon. The passive voice uses the past participle with some form of the verb to be, such as am, is, are, was, were, has been, have been, and had been. Again, let's look at examples because I find that looking at rules sometimes is not enough. It's a little bit confusing, but when you apply the rules to specific examples with an explanation of the example, that will really help you. So here are some examples of passive voice verbs. We've taken the sentence up here, the snowstorm crippled the city, which was active. Now look at it in the passive. The city was crippled by the snowstorm. If you look at this now, the subject is now acted upon in this passive voice. As well, you're using the past participle of the verb. So you've got was crippled. And as we mentioned here, in the passive voice, you will use some form of the verb to be as well as the past participle. And the past participle of the verb often ends in ed. The second example, here it was grade 10 students edited the school yearbook in the active. Let's take a look at the passive, how it's different. The school yearbook was edited by grade 10 students. So in this passive voice, you're using the past participle, which is frequently ending in ed. You're using the form of the verb to be, which was. And as you can see, the subject is not acting, but the subject is actually being acted upon. So the school yearbook was edited by the students. The third example was someone delivered the parcel today, which was active. Take a look at the passive. The parcel was delivered by someone today. So now no longer is the subject doing the action. The subject is acted upon. Again, you've got the ed verb, and you've also got some form of the verb to be, which is was. The last example, Susie planted lettuce and tomatoes in her garden. In this case, Susie's actually doing the action, so it's the active verb. But take a look at this one. Lettuce and tomatoes were planted by Susie in her garden. Here in this example, the subject is no longer performing the action, but the subject is being acted upon. You're also using the past participle of the verb, which, as I mentioned, it frequently ends in ed, and you've got some form of the verb to be. Here it's the verb were. So you might say, well, what's the difference? Why does it matter if I use the active or the passive voice? Let's look at the reasoning. Here are some reasons to use the active voice. The active voice is more brief and it's more direct. That's one reason why you use the active voice. Please let's look at these examples. The first one, active. The snowstorm caused a major traffic jam. Well, the snowstorm is the subject and it's doing the action. It's actually causing the major traffic jam, so it's the active voice. But if you're looking at it in the passive voice, you would say a major traffic jam was caused by the snowstorm. So now the subject is now acted upon. It's no longer doing the action. And if you take a look, in the passive form, often the verb ends in ed. You will have some form of the verb to be, which is was, and frequently you'll have a prepositional phrase beginning with a word such as by, not always, but frequently. So there's a difference between the use of active and passive in that example. In the next example, the second reason why you use the active voice will state the relationship, a clear relationship between the subject and the verb. You want it to be clear in your writing. What's the relationship between the two? Let's look at this sentence. I put it in both active and passive. The active form of this sentence, the manager denied Jim's request for a week's vacation that month. Your subject is manager, and the verb he's acting on, he's denying. He's denying Jim the request. So you clearly see what the relationship is. The manager doesn't want to give him his week's vacation, so the manager, his relationship is he's clearly denying the request. But if you look at the second example, which is the passive, Jim's request for a week's vacation that month was denied by his manager. It really changes the whole mood of that sentence. The subject now is being acted upon in the passive voice, and you can see that it was denied. His request was denied. There's your verb ending in ed. There's the verb was, which is the form of the verb to be, and there's your prepositional phrase, by his manager. So it's not as direct what the relationship is. It changes the relationship. And I've included a third reason why you might want to write in the active form, and that is you want to establish a more personal tone in your writing in the active. So if you look at the example that I've included, I wrote a letter to my aunt in Florida. It's very personal. The subject is I, the verb is wrote, and you're doing the action. I'm doing the action. So it's a very personal and it's very direct. So those are three reasons why you would use the active form of the verb. But now let's take it a little bit further and look at the reasons you may choose to write in the passive voice. Here's one. The writer may want to de-emphasize this person who's doing the action or the agent of the action. You don't want it to be as important, the subject. The person who's doing the action maybe isn't that important to what you're trying to say. The writer chooses to emphasize the person that is receiving the action rather than the person who's performing the action. Again, please look at this example and it'll clarify it for you. Over 100 different pollutants have been dumped into the river. So here you've got your ed verb, the past participle. You've got the verb have been, which is the forms of the verb to be, which will be in the passive. You've got a prepositional phrase of where it's being dumped into the river. And in this case, the person who's doing it is not really important. What you're stressing is the fact that over 100 different pollutants have been dumped into the river. So in this case, the passive voice is more effective because it doesn't matter. You're not stressing who's causing the pollutants. It's the fact that a lot of pollutants have been dumped into the river. Let's look at the second example. Our house alarm was triggered by my younger daughter. So you're not saying my younger daughter triggered the house alarm. That would make it the active voice. You're turning it into the passive. Our house alarm was triggered by my younger daughter. You've got the past participle, the ed verb. You've got was, which is the form of the verb to be. By my younger daughter is your prepositional phrase. And why did you choose this rather than saying my younger daughter triggered the house alarm? Because you want the focus to be taken away from the fact that it was your daughter's responsibility. It doesn't matter that she did it. What you're saying is the alarm was triggered. Maybe it's been triggered a number of times. This time it happens to be by your younger daughter, but maybe it's happened a number of times. So it doesn't matter who did it. You're just focusing on the fact that it was triggered. Okay, so that's one reason why you would choose to write in the passive voice. A second, if your readers do not need to know who is responsible for the action. So that is linking a little bit to taking the focus off, which is what you're saying here, but I've taken it a step further with this example. Here's the passive. The field quintuplets, Sarah, Susie, Sean, Sally, and Sammy, were delivered at 2 p.m. at Sunny Hospital yesterday. So I've written this sentence in the passive because if you wrote it this way, this would be an appropriate, for example, a birth announcement that might be sent to family and friends of the newborn baby. They don't care who the doctor is. They don't know who the doctor is. So there's no need to mention the name of the doctor. Their concern would be the safe arrival of the baby. So the field quintuplets were delivered at 2 p.m. at Sunny Hospital yesterday. If I wanted to write a sentence with similar thought in the active, here's what I might say. Dr. Brad Smithson delivered the field quintuplets at Sunny Hospital yesterday. So in this example, this would be using the active. It's more direct, and because you know exactly that Mr. Smithson delivered the babies. This may be a report at the hospital in a newsletter that is stating the events at the hospital, and they're naming Dr. Smithson as the doctor who performed the delivery. Now you might have put his name in this example too. You could have said the field quintuplets were delivered by Dr. Smithson at Sunny Hospital yesterday at 2 p.m. Again, it's not really important in the passive what the name of the doctor is, but in the active, you're saying who the doctor is because people in the hospital would be interested to know who delivered these quintuplets. Okay, and here's a third reason why you use the passive. You use the passive voice if the agent is common knowledge and there's no need to repeat who the agent is. In this case, Barack Obama became President of the United States after George W. Bush. So in this case, you can see that the agent is common knowledge, and so you're just stating it to make the point, and you're stating it in the passive. And the fourth and final reason why you would use passive voice in your writing is in technical reports, legal documents, lab reports, or scientific writing. This type of writing, more often than not, will use the passive voice. So keep that in mind. If you're writing technically, if you're reading something written by a lawyer, a legal document, a report for a lab, or any kind of scientific finding or writing, using the passive verb is much less personal. And you use the passive more often when you're stating facts, statistics, scientific methods, and procedures because you don't want to be personal, and the active uses the personal. So let's take a look at these examples. The first one, the active voice. Research shows that heart disease is the leading cause of death in the United States. You've got your subject research, you've got your verb shows, and that's the active. But take a look at the passive. Heart disease is considered the leading cause of death in the United States. You want it to be more factual, so you're using the passive. And you can see you've got the ed, the past participle. You've got the form of the verb to be as well. And then here's another example of active and passive. The jury delivered a unanimous decision within 1 hour. In this case, you've got the subject, jury, and it's acting upon the verb. The jury delivered a unanimous decision within an hour. But look at the passive, excuse me, within 1 hour, a unanimous decision was delivered by the jury. The subject is now acted upon. You've got the verb to be, which is was. You've got delivered, ending in ed, which is the past participle. And you've also got your prepositional phrase by the jury. So you're taking the same sentence, and you could see how it actually changes the sense and the focus of what you're trying to say, determining whether you're going to write an active or passive. So how do you form the passive voice? Well, here is a very simple chart to help you. First, the subject will be acted upon in the passive voice. So the president, you're going to have some form of the verb to be, so was. Nominated, the past participle, which frequently ends in ed. And sometimes it's optional, you'll have a phrase beginning with by the committee. The next example, the barn was constructed by the townspeople. You didn't say the townspeople construct the barn. So the subject is acted upon, the barn. You've got the part of the verb to be, was. You've got constructed, the verb ending in ed. And in this case, you've got the phrase by the townspeople. And in the last example, the essays are being acted upon. The essays are graded by the teachers. That should be a small b, by the teachers. You've got the verb to be, are. You've got the past participle, graded, ending in ed, and then you have the prepositional phrase, by the teachers. So all these show you how you form the passive voice. So a quick conclusion as a wrap-up, a couple of quick pointers to review. The passive voice uses a double verb. It's not just one verb. It's a double verb. For the passive voice, some form of the verb to be will be used, such as is, was, are, am. As well, you'll have the past participle of another verb. And it doesn't always end in ed, but it's frequently in ed. Active verbs are often more effective than passive verbs, depending on the reason for your writing. Only use the passive voice when there is a specific reason for your choice. Otherwise, it's best to write in the active voice. Active verbs will add clarity, impact, and vigor to your writing. And choose the passive voice if you do not want to emphasize the doer of the action. You're emphasizing the receiver of the action. So I hope you find that helpful. Please contact me within the website if you do have any further questions or you'd like some further examples to explain the differences between active and passive. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Bye-bye.